Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 8th Annual Community Lecture Series, sponsored by the University of Montana Alumni Association. Next week, we'll have another professor with us who has quite a reputation. His name is Bill Woosner, and he's a water expert. And the title of his lecture next week will be Water, Water Everywhere, Will There Be a Drop to Drink? And I think his lecture will be pretty interesting. Tonight we have Dr. Ronald H. Wakimoto, a professor of forestry at the University of Montana. He received his B.S. in forestry and his M.S. and Ph.D. in wildland resource science from the University of California at Berkeley. He began his faculty career at the University of California, Berkeley in 1976, and he's been at the University of Montana since '82, teaching and conducting research in wildland fire management. He teaches academic courses in wildland fire management, fuel management, and fire ecology. Dr. Wakimoto currently conducts research on the social acceptability of fuel management treatments, smoke quality and quantity from smoldering combustion, firefighter safety, crown fire spread, and the fire ecology of the northern mixed prairie. In 1986, he served on a committee of scientists in the National Park Service review of the prescribed burning programs at Sequoia/Kings Canyon National Park and Yosemite National Park. In 1988 and '89, Dr. Wakimoto was one of 2 academics to serve as technical advisors to the National Fire Policy Review Team following the Yellowstone events. In '97, he gave testimony on wildfire policy to the U.S. House Agricultural Committee. In 2000, he testified on the Montana fire fuel situation to the U.S. House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Forests and Forest Health. In 2001, he gave testimony to the same committee concerning the implementation of the National Fire Plan. In 2004, he was elected a Fellow by the Society of American Foresters. At this time, Ron Wakimoto.
Thank you, Ken. I want to make sure all this is going to go here. Wow. I'm pretty nervous about this whole thing, and I kept calling Ken, like, what's going to go on here, and I'm really happy to see a lot of friendly faces and friends that I know here that are in the audience. And that's what Ken essentially told me. I was here among friends, and I certainly feel that way now after seeing the group as you came in. A lot of folks I haven't seen in a long time. I have the pleasure of talking about fire today, and I want to be able to start this whole thing off, and I got to warn you that we do have some kind of technical difficulty that's certainly kind of frustrating, because I have some videos embedded in this presentation, and instead of giving us this great big full screen that would be pretty exciting with all the sound, it's going to, for some reason, and I'm sort of a techno peasant, and the fellows who really know that stuff, they've been working on this since 5 o'clock, and they can't make the thing work to the full screen, so we get a little screen instead of the big thing. So you'll have to bear with us when we get to that point. Fire is an interesting topic to me because, when you think about it, and we're in this setting here in this auditorium, it's one of the few words where we really don't have necessarily the freedom of speech to just shout it out here. People, every one of you has a different kind of relationship to that fire, and I hope you'll think about that. Some event that happened in your life where, I had one where my buddy and I were lighting firecrackers, and he was so scared when he threw the cherry bomb, he threw the match the other way. And maybe you've done that too. Other people have had different kind of incidents, different kinds of, they relate to that whole idea of fire very differently. I'm going to ask you something here, because this is a very different crowd than I'm used to talking to. I do normally lower division undergraduate students when I talk about fire. And so I'm going to ask you a question that no one's probably asked you in a long, long, long time, but I got to get a feeling for it here. How many of you went to high school? Like I said, long time, east of the Mississippi River. East of the Mississippi River. Oh, a pretty good number. Okay. And I assume everybody else was either in another country or west of the Mississippi River. Okay? Okay. I ask that because when you look at fire statistics, what you find is that, when you see something like that, you have a gut reaction. And when you've gone to high school and you've lived east of the Mississippi, what you find is that if you look at national forest statistics about fire, year in and year out, 95% of all those fires that start in the national forest east of the Mississippi are caused by people. Somebody screwed up. Okay? So that's a gut reaction about when you see something like, oh, that's terrible. What happened? When you see that big red slide. I don't have the helium-filled balloons like Garen does, but I have big red slides. All right? In contrast to that, maybe not, depending on where you were west of the Mississippi, but if you look at National Forest System statistics west of the Mississippi, year in and year out, 50 to 75% of all fires are caused by lightning. Okay? Natural process. Something we don't control. It's beyond our control. And so Westerners tend to think more about fire in a different way. And I think in different press situations, large incidences of fire, you can really see that difference. I certainly saw it in '88 on the National Fire Policy Review Team where Western channels were out there trying to learn something about the fire ecology of lodgepole pine and putting that on the screen. At the same time, CNN was in the bar, with a microphone. Who screwed up? Why'd this happen? And it's just an attitude and a belief about fire. So I hope you'll get with your, where you feel about it, because it's a very different subject when we talk about it in the West. When we talk about it in the West, I want you to come away with the idea that it's not whether we have a fire or not. The real question is when, where, and how big. Right? That's the real question. When, where, and how big. And I think that in 2002 with the Black Mountain 2 fire, if you were here in Missoula at that time, I think that brought that reality home. It's when, where, and how big. It's not that it's not going to happen to us. So let's talk a little bit more about fire. Anybody know where this is? Since this is a great group, huh? Yeah, it's Prim Meadows. Prim Meadows. Thanks to a lot of caring folks, we now have this preserved. This is, boy, that light's pretty bright right there. Yeah, it's got a lot of glare on the screen. Can we affect the house light? That one, that floodlight right there. There we go. Okay. Is that better? Okay. Prim Meadows is a wonderful place. This is actually about a 20-year-old slide. Look at the grass in there. Unfortunately, it's almost all knapweed now. But when the early settlers came here, they assumed that these grasslands were natural. And in reality, when we begin to look at the fire history of a lot of these kinds of places, it was probably native people or the farmers before that, the Prims and the people before that, who actually, burned some of that land. And in fact, if you look at the ecology of our forests, in these low elevation ponderosa pine forests, the more fire, the more frequent the fire, and the more fire in general, the more grass we have. And so there were lots of resources that we had in western Montana that people thought were natural when they first came here. They grazed the heck out of this land as well. But it wasn't necessarily natural. And that open and park-like stand, you've probably heard that phrase, you've probably seen it in the papers, the open and park-like ponderosa pine, ride a horse through. This is what they're talking about in terms of that early forest, in some ways the forest that grew without us. We might have Native American ignitions. I'll talk about that a little later, but Native American ignitions, we might have a lightning strike that moves from the way of the base of the tree, the fire slowly spreads out, and fairly low intensity. The role of fire at that time in our forest was certainly one of a very high frequency and low intensity when we look at the history of the forests. Okay, that role of fire was one of that low intensity. And we know that because we do a lot of different fire scar analysis where we cut into the tree, look at the fire scar and the repeated damage that the fire's done to the base of the tree, and we can actually count the rings between those years. I'll put up a picture here in a little bit, but when you see that, you begin to realize there was a lot of fire in these forests, and some of us now are really questioning, how much that was lightning. We've often, when we do our park management, when we do our wilderness fire management now, when we say the word natural, we mean lightning. And that may not have been the most significant ignition source. So certainly the role of fire was one of low intensity. It also did a lot to affect the structure of the stands. And this is where it kind of relates to what we're talking about now. Everybody's telling us we should go out there and thin that stuff to protect our houses. We have to cut trees, we have to thin the stands, and part of that's because when we took fire out of the system, we changed the stand structure of those forests. And here's an example. I want to be able to give you some history here. When we look at forest stands and we looked at reproduction and how those stands evolved prior to, say, the 1870s, what we find is that there were very large openings in the forest. Remember that grass that I talked about and all the grazing? Those were large openings. Stands were even aged that did survive those frequent fires, but there were large openings between these various stands of trees. And in fact, those big openings were probably about twice as wide as the surrounding stand of trees. And the reason for that, of course, is that as the litter fell out of those trees, they'd cover that whole opening, and that frequent fire would kill all the seedlings out in the opening. So the forests were really open, and the settlers liked that because they were here to graze livestock. Well, that was the kind of stand we had that grew without us. So very open, even-age groups, wide spaces between us. And it's kind of interesting for me in that when if you think about that, you stand in an opening. Some of you, if you think about these trees, the largest being 100 feet tall, you stand in an opening 100, 200 feet across, say 150 feet across, and there's no regeneration. No regeneration at all. Why is there no regeneration? To the early foresters is because of the enemy of the forest, fire. So it was the professional foresters. I'm one of them. There are a number of professional foresters here in this audience. That was the main push to take fire out of the forest. Let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't an ecological thing. It wasn't any of these things. It was to grow trees. And the foresters of this country mounted a big effort to make sure that we found a way to try to eliminate fire from the forest. Okay, that's really how we came to do that, because those big openings with no regeneration. Another thing that fire did, as well as change the stand structure, was it changed species composition. This little tree here, if you can recognize that, a professional forester probably could recognize, that's a little Douglas fir. Little Douglas fir in the understory. Those are very shade-tolerant trees. If you go up in Patty Canyon, some of you may live there, go up there and you see in the understory and in the middle part of that stand, you see a lot of Douglas fir trees. That's the common tree that we cut here for Christmas trees. Well, what would you grab if you have a choice of a tree, when you go out with your kids or whatever, and you cut a Christmas tree, what are you looking for in a Christmas tree? Okay? Shape, nice conical shape, probably a crown that goes all the way down, right? You want it to be kind of bushy, right? Not a lot of space between the nodes, right? That's an annual growth, the space between the nodes. So you want that tree to be kind of slow growing, so it's nice and dense and bushy, and that nice conical shape. Well, that's the tree that comes up in the understory in these ponderosa pine. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But those trees are more shade tolerant. I'll use that term here. They can grow in the low light of these forests. And so as we took fire out, fire was an important part. It killed those Douglas fir. When I use prescribed fires at Lubrecht Forest, we can run one fall prescribed fire and probably kill every Douglas fir tree on the site under 10 feet tall. Just a low intensity fire, but a fall fire. Fall fire being burning a little deeper in the organic material, girdling that tree. It might not torch out the tree might not burn at all, but it will kill every single Douglas fir and eliminate them for a long period of time. You know, if you know anything about trees, you find that Douglas fir, like a lot of our other conifers, has a periodicity when it has a good seed year. Perhaps maybe every 8 to 10 years when we get a really good seed year. And so this frequency of fire, when we've looked at it in western Montana, we find the frequency of fire ranging from any place between 8 to about 25 years. So this frequent fire was actually changing the species composition of the forest, maintaining ponderosa pine there as well. Another thing that fire in the forest that grew without us, the thing that the fire did was it really affected the amount of organic material that was in the forest laying around. This material often represents refugia for various fungi, good and bad in terms of those fungi, in terms of microorganisms that are there. But it presented an organic substrate that in some cases allowed different types of disease organisms to survive as well. And that fire cleaned it up. It burned that organic material out. And as you go out in the woods now, you know, you see it everywhere. European foresters often kid us that we're managing garbage dumps, okay, because of what they see out there in the organic material that's in the forest. And here's an example of that fire scar. I think most people are familiar with this. We have an example here where, let's see, I did it here. One of the things I'll point out, this is that fire scar right here is the cambium layer that's underneath the bark, and that's what's alive. This is wood here, it's dead. And what happened when this tree was quite small, much younger here, in this case before 1800, it was first scarred, and then of course in a ponderosa pine tree, if you know anything about trees, the trees don't heal. I'll say that again. I also teach urban forestry at night, so I'll tell you, trees never heal. They seal off the area, and they allow sort of a sacrifice zone beyond that seal, where all the pitch is embedded in the wood. Okay, so that tree will carry that scar for the rest of its life. That's the same thing true if these students want to park their bicycles and chain it to a tree, and they cut through the bark, that scar will be there for the life of the tree. I try to emphasize that when I'm teaching the class. All right? But so what happens then is the tree puts that pitch in there, puts the pitch out to seal off the area to prevent the mycelia of various fungi from growing through it or insects from invading the site. And of course that stuff is very flammable. So once you fire scar that tree that first time, it becomes this perfect recorder of those fires. There can be probably fires that are too low intensity. So when you see fire scar analysis where they generate a mean fire interval, that being the average number of years between fires, okay, that mean fire interval, that average number of years between fires, that's the maximum length that could have happened, because we could have had a lot of intermediate fires that were too low intensity to even scar the tree. In this case, what I want to look at is way up here. You see one here in 1879 or 1879, 1889, a 20-year gap here. And then, like most of the West, and I think that's what people have a hard time believing, that if you look at fire-scarred ponderosa pine throughout the entire western United States, between 1860 and 1870, in a lot of places, fires stop. Something as common as wind and rain, with all these different fire scars here in the forest, stops between 1870 and 1880. And that's not just here in Montana, it's kind of all through the West, whether we're in Arizona, in Ponderosa Pine, or we're in the Sierra Nevadas in Ponderosa Pine. We see this big growth right here where there are no fires. I'll throw that out to you. Why would that be the case? That was a quiz. That was a question, a bonus question on my exam that I gave about 3 days ago. Anybody? Hmm? Wet years, moisture, suppression, fire suppression. Yeah.
Like they wanted to make sure the trees don't die off, and they didn't know that sometimes the ecosystem needs.
Yeah.
So they would, like humans would interfere.
And put those fires out, huh? Yeah. Economy was good? Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
What about subjugation of the American Indian?
Yeah, that's probably the main thing to me. During that period of time, Native people who were still out on the land were forced to go to reservations. The survivors were put on the reservations. And if you read, well, I'll ask that group here, how many have read Undaunted Courage? Yeah, hey, that's a great book. It's a great read. Maybe we'll kind of challenge how good it was, but it's certainly a great read, Undaunted Courage. When you read that book, you really see that difference, people being here, lots of people being here. And they moved from place to place. They burned in different ways, probably 17 to 20 different reasons why they might burn. I won't cover that here, but there were lots of, we'll hint at some of those, but they were burning all the time. And we end up with a situation now where the survivors are on reservations. We've essentially lost an ignition source. And it's a very important ecological one because we're talking about modern man. Native people could see that all the leaves have come out of this aspen stand. The sunlight's penetrating the bottom all the way to the ground in this aspen stand, and it's good and dry. When they walked through it, they could hear it, and they could light it on fire. Okay? When in reality, when lightning comes and we have aspen, typically they're all leafed out, they're shading the ground, higher moisture, all those things, so they'd never burn. In fact, we've been trying to burn aspen. It's pretty darn hard. Okay? And so you really have to have that flexibility, and I'm kind of saying something about the agencies. The agencies that want to burn now have to have a little more flexibility in being able to light that match, because they have to be able to sense when it is right and when it isn't. So that's a very important thing there, that Native Americans were removed as an ignition source, because it's very different than lightning. Lightning occurs in a certain period of time. Some places it's associated with rain. And I'm going to finish here talking about Bhutan, but lots of different things like that. Another reason, that's part of the equation. Native people were taken off the scene as far as an ignition source. How about another one? Yeah.
Grazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. Grazing, real extensive grazing. I know that John Muir didn't coin the term, but you heard the term mountain maggots for sheep. Okay? Imagine that you're above the Sebin Ranch, above Helena, and you come across a sheep herder pushing 20,000 sheep through the woods. What would that look like? It would look like maggots munching away on that carcass. Okay? Those white, furry sheep eating all that stuff. In those days, we had large die-offs from poisonous plants. Because if you're the last sheep in line, you're not going to look and say, oh, is that any good to eat? If it's still green, you're going to eat it, see? And that's why we had those kinds of problems. Large bands of sheep, in the Sierras, all of these forest lands. You have to realize that the time period we're talking about, heck, we finished the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. So we're shipping things and moving things, and there's a whole commerce that has to be fed. We had to feed the Civil War. So there were lots of animals out there grazing these lands. And of course, these open ponderosa pine forests that we had displaced the native people, it was all covered with grass. Think about that when you walk out in the woods again this summer. How much grass do you see now in these forests that haven't had fire? You probably won't see a whole lot of grass. Okay? Now, what do we have in terms of the situation? We've taken fire out. We've had this fire suppression. And I want to come back to that. I said 1870, 1880. That's what the record in the trees shows. Forest Service didn't come into being until 1905. And it really didn't pay people to start fighting fire until 1910. So there was this period where that was a major influence. There's a reason why the early rangers for the Forest Service could put out a lot of fire with one shovel and 8 canteens. You might have seen pictures of them with all these canteens on a horse, and they got this shovel in their hat, and they're out there, and they were very effective at putting out fires. Why? Because the fires, so many fires had occurred before, there was very low fuel loading out in the forest. You were dealing with grass fires, not heavy wood fires. So with a shovel and a canteen, you could be pretty effective. This is the kind of condition we have now. And you've probably heard this before, but we have this situation now where we have all this ladder fuel. That's what the agencies would term it. We have a situation where fires can grow. We have other situations. This is a east side, eastern Montana side shot where we made openings in the forest. Remember I said that there were these big openings in the forest? Twice as high as the surrounding trees. This is a situation on private land where they made these big openings rather than reduce the stocking systematically. They made big openings. You can see the ponderosa pine that jumped out of the ground. Foresters were very happy because as we took fire out, trees began to enter those openings. First of all, it would be ponderosa pine, and then the Douglas fir would come in afterwards. So we're changing the structure of that forest again, putting very high density stands. Another thing that has changed, and I describe it as the role of insects and disease. That's what's really changed here in the forest. This is a spruce budworm. And when I say that the role has changed, you know, this is a natural insect. It's occurred here thousands of years. It's part of our forest. And yet, periodically, we have major problems with spruce budworm, this particular critter here. It eats the New Year's growth on a Douglas fir tree. Okay? And now, in the forest that we have now, we have these all-age stands of Douglas fir, all-age stands, because they've been seeding in, they don't require fire, they can grow in that low light. So we have all these stands at different ages, different heights. A lot of people drive here from the east and think that's a natural forest. Okay? It's a very unnatural one for one that's being born of fire. And what happens now, if you think about the ecology of this critter, the way this insect goes through its life stages is it actually spins a web and floats down through the canopy of the trees. And then when that web catches a tree, it moves to the bole or moves to the branch, moves out on the end, eats the new growth, and then as it goes through another instar or life stage, it floats down again. Well, if you have a forest now that's composed of Douglas fir of all age classes, what happens is that insect can go through its entire life cycles and never have a predator take it out. When in the other case, when we had relatively even age groups of trees and it floated down, it'd probably land on the ground. Ants and other things would probably kill it and eat it. So what we found in our studies is that there's no more outbreaks. They're not any more intense. What we found is that the duration of the outbreak of this defoliation of Douglas fir is longer and longer. In the 70s, we used to spray the Bitterroot Valley with DDT to get this critter. Okay? So we've really kind of changed in what we do. There's an example of that Douglas fir eating the new growth, and you can imagine if that's the most photosynthetically efficient growth on the tree is that new growth each year. And that's exactly what that insect is eating. Other examples now, we see a lot of places in western Montana where Douglas fir beetle is taking out Douglas fir, whether we're down in the Bitterroot or in the Blackfoot drainage. A number of areas we see these patches of dead trees here, these Douglas fir, that conical shape, and they're being killed. And what's happened now is that we have a forest that's a situation where we have such a density of forests that it's like a drought. There's so many trees there that we can't utilize that moisture. Remember, this was probably a ponderosa pine site. We took those ponderosa pine to the Bonner Mill a long time ago, and we released all that Douglas fir that was in the understory that got going 50 years ago. So that's what's on this site. This is a hot, dry site with not a lot of water, not a lot of rainfall, and we have this high-density stand of Douglas fir. Douglas fir beetle, fortunately for us, has typically not been an aggressive beetle. But it can be aggressive now because we have all these high-density stands and these stressed trees. Okay, so it's becoming a major problem here, all because we took fire out of the system. And that's an example of a beetle. That beetle's actually lost the battle. It's been pitched out of the tree. So that's the tree's defense, is putting this pitch out. That's just an example of the galleries. I don't necessarily want to dwell on that. Okay. Right here, because of all these changes, that stand structure and composition, the role of fire, and the amount of and the role of insects and disease, all those things are creating fuel conditions such that on a typical July day, not some day that's the terrifying, 50-mile-an-hour wind kind of day, but on a more typical day that we would have in our July here in Missoula, Montana, now we have a situation where an ignition, whether it's people making a mistake or lightning going on, quickly becomes more intense. And as you can see here, we're getting this fire that's moving up, moves up into the higher crowns because of those ladder fuels, and we end up with a situation where we have fire behavior much beyond our control. When we talk about fire management, we often talk about flame lengths. Okay, you can see we're talking about hundreds of feet of flame lengths. Typically, in terms of limits to any kind of control, simply 8-foot flames are beyond that limit to about any kind of control. 8 feet versus 200 feet. Okay, very different in terms of what we can expect to do. Now, the real problem with that is because of the growing urban interface. You've probably had people talk to you at infinitum about this particular subject, but it really is a problem, because now when we used to have this friendly flame in the forest, now we have the forest set up with all large fuel loadings, the different stand structure, the different composition, and a likelihood of ignition. Anybody know where that is? That's Patty Canyon, 1977. Okay, so I just want you to understand, fire can come home. Okay, I was just up there with Harold McGahee up the top of that, looking at some different homes and looking at clearance and different things like that, trying to help him out. And this is Patty Canyon, 1977 in Missoula, Montana. Right, so it can come here, and it's come here before. One of the big things that urban interface does is it changes our strategies on fires. And I think you saw that the governor was really concerned the last go-around of our fire situation about what is this really doing because of this interface. We have to change strategies because we have to protect homes rather than put out the wildfire. Right? So it really is an important part of what we're doing, and it affects a great deal of what we do, whether we like it or not. when I give these talks, I try to make sure I don't have somebody's house in here, okay? You can imagine that's the case. So a lot of these are from north of here. It still might be your house, but here's an example. This is an example of one of those open sunlit ponderosa pine sites that's been taken over by Douglas fir. The beetles might have taken out the old ponderosa pine, all the Douglas firs released, and here we are with a log house sitting there. I would bet the other part of the story is that you can't find a street sign to even find where that house is. A lot of our fire managers on major wildfires have a very difficult time just finding all the houses out in the woods because there's no maps to where those houses are. Okay, that's a real tough issue. Little drier site, less Douglas fir, lots of fuel, but in ponderosa pine. Nice house stuck in there. I suspect that one probably has a shake roof. And you can see the pile of railings. They took the railings in this fence apart and they stacked it over there. So again, another kind of problem. This is on Big Mountain, the state protection, so it's a tough deal. This is in more of a lodgepole pine site, but you can see you have this structure, a receptive structure, you have fuels right there, and you have a big deck, a big flying deck there that can absorb all these sparks. And we'll see some videos in a little bit here that's why this change has really come home to us, is because of this difference here in the urban interface. Another one, very nice house, log structure, lots of nooks and crannies to be ignited by these various burning embers. Now, I alluded to it earlier, everybody's telling us we have to thin. And I want to tell you now that in terms of thinning and thinning and thinning in trying to protect homes or to create a barrier to fire, there's no science there. Okay? If you think about thinning a stand of trees, you're simply making them hotter, drier, and windier. Think about that. Hotter, drier, windier, if you thin a stand of trees. So the real question is, how do you treat the surface fuels? When I went to my very first prescribed burn when I was at Berkeley, I was with my mentor, Harold Biswell, and we went to a resort to burn. And we went up there, and we were really excited. You know, here we're Berkeley students, you know, and we were going to get to light something on fire. I should also tell you this is about 1969, 1970, so that's the other thing that's going on with us. But we went up with Harold to a place called Hoburg's Resort that's in the interior coast range above the wine country. And we got there and we were pretty excited, and you know, a lot of us had fought fire for the Forest Service or state agencies, and the first thing that Harold did is he handed me a broom. He handed me a broom. And I said, Harold, what do you want me to do with this broom? And he says, I want you to go over to that cabin and I want you to sweep all the needles off the porch, and then I want you to go around the building and sweep all the needles away from the foundation. We're going to burn right up to the edge of that foundation. Okay? And he said, don't worry about it over there. That doesn't count. What counts is right there. Right? In more recent research, Jack Cohen and his associates at the fire lab tend to bear that out, that what you really want to treat is that place by the home. It's not going with the song, thinning the trees, but at the same time, it's a pretty effective measure. And Harold Biswell was certainly not pulling any punches, because we burned right to the edge of the foundations of those houses. That same resort was burned over by a wildfire. They lost no buildings, okay, in the 50s. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to treat these sites? What fuel treatments are reasonable? What is effective? And just, it's kind of interesting, you know, the scientific community, you heard Garen Smith talk about, you know, our whole scientific philosophy and the way in which we approach science. And a lot of our work now, we've tried to go away from what we call ex post facto research, after the fact, you know. I tell people I don't chase fire trucks, Okay? Because that's ex post facto research. You're going after the fact. And more recently, however, there's a lot to learn from looking after the fact in these ex post facto studies. And so what happens is, in a number of these sites, in this particular fire, this is the Hayman fire in Colorado that burned in 2002. It burned 138,000 acres in about 28 days or so, something like that. Maybe, I guess about 20 days. It started off on a pretty hot July afternoon. It burned maybe 1,000 acres that first day. The next day, the winds might have blown at 50 miles an hour. And it went to 60,000 acres. Okay, so it's really kind of testing what works and what doesn't. And Mark Finney and a number of others from the Fire Lab got an opportunity because of a congressional inquiry. They got the opportunity to kind of look ex post facto at this fire. And this is an example of the sheep-nose timber sale. Surface fuels here were not treated. They were not removed prior to the logging. And what you see here is a stand that, okay, come on. What you see here is this piece here, this was that timber sale. It's probably about 100% mortality. And we would expect that. If you don't treat the slash, that's what would happen. So other people have been talking about different kinds of treatments we want to do. Here's another example. Here's a Goose Creek timber sale area in part of that fire. As you can see, it was cut between 1986 and 1993. Here, the slash was piled and burned. That's probably one of the most common things we do on private land. We pile the slash and we burn the slash. That's the big chunks of woody fuel. And again, the same result, where was adequate surface fuel, high intensity surface fire. In other words, we didn't treat the litter on the site. We treated the woody stuff. And I'd have to say that our sampling techniques, when we try to look at forest fuels, they're focused on woody stuff. Okay, tons per acre. And people ignore the little stuff. When in reality, that is what spreads the fire and certainly gave us enough intensity to kill all those trees. It was high enough intensity. Even though they did that work, the fire was high enough intensity to kill the trees. Here's another example. This one's a little different. This is the Bush Creek timber sale. It was prescribed burned, but it was prescribed burned about, let's see, 12 years prior to the fire. So the trees expanded, they produced more litter, even though it was prescribed burned. And again, the results are the same. It was very high intensity. This is that day when the wind blew at 50 miles an hour. Okay, and again, high intensity surface fire and high mortality in that stand. So you begin to wonder, well, what will work in these kind of conditions? And here's an example. Here we're looking at a big turkey wildfire down in this portion here. And you can see the dead trees from that fire that burned in 1998. Right here in the foreground here, we're looking at a prescribed fire, the Turkey 1990 prescribed fire. That fire, because it's a prescribed fire, burned and it consumed those fine fuels. And you can see those are green trees. This burned through in the wildfire that burned in 2002. And yet the trees survived because of that low intensity of fire, that change. And that's another 10-year-old situation. This burned on June 10th, so we weren't dealing with the same 50-mile-an-hour winds. But we were still 15 to 20-mile-an-hour winds when that site burned. So there is some hope, and the prescribed fire does seem to treat the fuels that are important. Here's an example here of the schoonover. This is kind of like duh to me, because here, this fire happened in the spring of 2002, and the wildfire burned in July of 2002. So about as good as you can get in terms of a fuel treatment, okay? And sure enough, right here is the line, this is the site, and that fire did not kill those trees. They survived. Here's another one. This is the Bohemus prescribed fire. This was done in the fall of 2002, or 2001. So it's a one-year-old fire. And right here, you see that black squiggly line right there. That was drawn in on this. And it shows the actual fire line for the prescribed fire. And you can see the difference where the fire carried and did not carry through this prescribed fire. So you can see that there is some hope, but it's kind of a tough one because you have to burn a whole lot. You begin to wonder, wait a minute, how often are we going to have to treat these sites to keep them from burning up? And that's an important one. And people often wonder, how did we ever grow forests before when we still had all those fires? And part of that, and I'll let you read that, part of that is because of our myth about what we had here prior to Luther Standing Bear, the chief of the Oglala Sioux, made this statement: only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was land infested with wild animals and savage people. And like we said earlier, the ignition source of Native people really gave us, and I have to emphasize this, it didn't give us what a lot of people would like to refer to as a natural landscape as the first explorers saw it. What I'm saying to you is that what we're looking at is a cultural landscape where people were actively burning to make a living here. Now, this particular quote has a lot of meaning to me. When I gave congressional testimony to one of those subcommittees, I made the statement that Native people have been burning the western United States for the last 13,000 years. And of course, the Missoulian grabbed that and put it in the paper. And sure enough, there was a letter to the editor from some guy from Kalispell. Okay? And he essentially said, the professor can dig all he wants, he's never going to find a Bic lighter. Okay? Now, remember Garen was talking about that scientific method? I want to raise this issue. You know, that's the science. How am I going to find the lighter? Where am I going to get the proof that Native people have been doing all this burning? Where am I going to get the proof when there's no record? Native people didn't write the language. There's nothing there. And the proof to me is that they're here. So I didn't write a response to that letter to the editor. I'll ask you folks to think about that. Could a people live in Montana with all the vagaries of weather and the changes and the, you know, what they say, wait a minute, right, if you don't like the weather, all right? With all that change, how could a people live here in Montana for 13,000 years if they couldn't light a fire about any time, any place they wanted to? Okay? Just think about that. That's a different kind of knowledge. It's not the scientific method, but that Garen was talking about. But it is, I think it's pretty clear to me, it is to me, that people were able to use fire and to do it about any time they wanted. If they imagine them coming across the Bering Ice Bridge and not being able to do that, to come here to North America. Okay? So I do want to talk about this idea of the wilderness. Here's an example when I talk about Native people and fire. Here's an example. This was actually a mock-up, 1903 photo describing a mock-up starting a prairie fire. And people see this and they go, oh, that's kind of nice, you know, the Native people were lighting the fire to improve the grass, to attract the animals so they could hunt them, right? I mean, that would make sense to a lot of folks. Here's the Charlie Russell of a 1905 Charlie Russell of a similar scene. The title of this is Blackfeet Burning Crow Range. Okay? Charlie Russell was a very astute observer of those people, and you see this fellow's pretty concerned about who's going to come up behind them, because if they're spotted, they better hope their ponies can really run, or they're dead. All right? And so what we see is a situation with Native people where they were actively burning for a wide array of different reasons, whether it's to have reeds at a certain thickness so that it's nice for making baskets, or it's enhancing certain plants, or attracting certain animals 5 to 10 years down the line after the fire, or in this case, making it so the crows have a hard time making a living in the winter. Okay? You burn that grass, it's dry because it's the fall, and you burn the grass, the bison aren't going to come there to eat, okay, because there's nothing there to eat. There's lots of stories about that when you read the literature in the West about Native people burning and eliminating grass over large areas. Now, this whole idea of wilderness I want to address in that sense of Native people. Charles Kay, who's a research professor at the University of Colorado, has made a living being a thorn in a lot of people's sides and talking about Native peoples. And so I want to tell you that some of the stuff I'm going to show you is not all accepted readily by the academics. But what Charles did is he looked at the journals of Lewis and Clark. That's kind of close to home because we're in the bicentennial, right? And he looked at the journals of Lewis and Clark, and he divided the trip, and this is an example, he divided into trip segments, he numbered them, and at the same time he had different day lengths where they were. Like here's where they were on the Lochsaw River, on the Lemhi River, Fort Clatsop, how many days they were there, all of those kinds of things. And he divided it into either days or into trip segments. And he decided to look at where these breaks were, because the journals were excellent examples of how many animals they shot. If you read, like a lot of people did, if you read Undaunted Courage, boy, they shot their way across Montana. All right? They weren't fooling around. When you have 32 or 33 guys, they ate, what was the estimate? 8 pounds per day? Think about that. My cardiologist wouldn't like that very much for me. This is just an example here of the segments in the days. So what Charles did is he plotted the incidence of where Lewis and Clark came and met Native people. Here's a mean abundance of all wildlife. The mean abundance, that's numbers of wildlife they saw. And here's the mean daily abundance of Native people, where they ran into people and how many wildlife did they see that same day, because they're trying to hunt as they're moving across this topography that we call Montana. And as you see, there is a relationship here, the fact that the more people they saw, the fewer animals they saw. Okay? That would kind of make sense if you think about hunting and avoidance. And he went further. He began looking at his days as they were moving across, in this case, across the Dakotas. And what he talked about here is this kind of buffer zone, because here we had the Yankton Sioux, and they were warring with these Omahas and these Otts here. And they're in a war zone. So right here is where there's conflict, where there's this buffer, because you don't want to go out there and get caught with not enough people, because you'll be killed. So they're actually warring, and where the wildlife was the greatest and the largest number that Lewis and Clark could shoot was between these places, okay, because they were actively hunting and they were at war. So the buffer areas were very important. High numbers of animals, all wildlife. Here's bison right here, and you can see it drops down when they do see people in that whole scene. Another example, if we think about this, I don't know, when I read Undaunted Courage, I had this feeling that this whole place was just this rolling supermarket with bison there to get anytime you wanted. And that's kind of my sense of it. And yet when they actually looked at it and took those days when they're hunting, here's a situation, again, here's the Sioux and the Mandans in the buffer. And here we are with a situation where here's all this wildlife, because here's the Mandans who were in war situation with the Arikara and the Teton Sioux, and yet there was a confederation here among these two tribes. Okay, there was a confederation here, so there's not necessarily a large number of animals between them, because they were fighting together and with these Mandan and Hidatsis. So again, that situation where while we think it's a wilderness, Native people had a great influence on the number of wildlife that we saw out there. And here's another one. Now this one is kind of simplified. This is the trip segment rather than the days. So it kind of expands, and it sort of blows maybe the difference out of proportion. But here's the example of these various trip segments: bison, all wildlife, and again, Native people, the numbers of Native people that they came across as they're moving across here. And this is, again, moving from east to west. Another one here. This is Lewis. Let's see. Again, this time is west to east. Okay? And they're coming back. Again, that same kind of thing where we have high numbers of bison, high numbers of wildlife in general when we didn't see a lot of people, when that buffer was in effect. Even Clark observed this when they separated and Clark went down the Yellowstone, went towards the Yellowstone country. Again, the same situation where within the trip segments we had large numbers of wildlife when we didn't see native people. Again, here's a Marias. This is that dangerous one where Lewis was almost killed. But again, that same kind of situation where we see people, where we don't, large numbers of wildlife. I put this up here. Let's see. I want to go? Yeah, we'll stop there. I put this up there because I want to emphasize that there are some estimates that we might have as many as 100 million native people in the 1500s here in North America. Okay? They were killed by various pandemics and diseases that were introduced by the Spanish as they came up in the southwest and the southeast, as those diseases like smallpox decimated the populations. And as you read the journals of Lewis and Clark, you'll find that they came to various Mandan villages that were empty. Okay? Whole villages that were empty because people died. And so this whole idea of this myth of the wilderness and the myth of this abundance of wildlife was an artifact that we lost all those people. And we had them at one time. Okay? I just want to emphasize that. So that wilderness that Luther Standing Bear was talking about, he understood that because they talked in stories and they talked about those stories. And I do want to talk a little bit about this educational process. You remember Guerin talked about that scientific method, how we lay out hypotheses and test them that first day. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about the difficulty of trying to educate Native American students here at the university. I think a lot of people have an automatic, oh, why can't we do this? We've got classrooms, we've got all this material, we have professors that can talk about this. I've come to realize that it's a very difficult problem here. And it's not because of the lack of intelligence or IQ, any of those things. It's because of very incredibly strong cultural differences in how they learn. And I do want to say that to you as a well-educated crowd to think about this. That here I have a student who's healthy and bright, but all his life, he's learned to respect his elders and to listen to those stories. Native people didn't have that written language. So they told stories about how the land related to them, how the wildlife related to them. And those students that we have here now don't question those stories. They don't form hypotheses. They don't question, is that the way it is or is that the way it is? They take it straight away because the elders said that, and that's their life. The other part is that they view themselves as part of the system, the circle of life, not the observer, the scientist looking at the situation. Now think about that. If you're used to listening to stories, you don't question the information that you come across. It's part of who you are. You're a very proud part of you are. Those people lived here for 13,000 years. They made it because of those stories. And yet, think about it, when I plunk them down in 200 level class and someone gives them a multiple choice test, or even worse, maybe a true-false test, when they've never questioned what that is. Okay? And those are pretty common in the lower division because you have large classes and you want to use a computer to grade the tests and get them done. Think about that. I'll just share that with you now that we were talking about Native people and fire here, but at the same time it's an important part of what we do at the university, trying to educate people, and some people can't figure out why we can't do certain things. And we work at it, try to do those things. I don't give, my fire management course is all essays where they can write, they can talk And sometimes I tell stories, so that's part of the deal. All right, now we're at this part. I want to shift gears because we got to kind of wake people up and get them excited here again. So unfortunately, this is, like I said, I'm a techno-peasant. And we had the real high-techies in here trying to make this work, and they couldn't. So what I have are video clips. I want you to get a feeling for what it's like when a crown fire is burning. And it's not shifting gears completely here, but we're talking about high-energy crown fires. This is part of the International Crown Fire modeling experiment that was done in 1998 through 2000, or 1997 through 2000 in Canada. Okay? We can't light these fires here. We go to the Northwest Territories. Rick Lanaville burns the heck out of these places, and you'll see them. Okay? And, but you'll see some fire behavior. And you can imagine if you're in a place where you have the stand structure and the composition right up against your house, why you have a problem with these kinds of urban interface fires. Let's see if I can do this now. I had a question here about the wind. The winds were less than 15 miles an hour. This is that crown fire that's making its own wind once the convection begins to go. This is sort of the frontal assault as it comes at you. That's jack pine. I'm sorry. Yes, that's real time. All these videos I'm showing you are real time. That's a good point. Okay, let me kind of summarize that. What you can't see, because these are so small, is that out in front of that fire we had numerous fire shelters that wildland firefighters use. We had different examples of fire protective clothing, personal protective clothing. We had a number of examples out there of let's see, hard hats, gloves, things like that. And unfortunately, a lot of that was put out there so that the scientists could see what it looks like after a fatal incident, so that you have an idea what kind of fire, what kind of situation the person really was in. This is an example of the old style fire shelter. These are not the fire shelters that we use now. The ones we have now are a little lower profile. I'm still not sure why this one was put in here, because this is actually out in the forest. I want you to realize that fire shelters will not help you if you're out in the forest. You need to be in at least a 300-foot wide clearing so that the radiation will not affect you. This is an example here. This shelter it can take a lot of radiation, quite a bit of radiation. What we're going to see is actual flame contact here in this case. The point that I want to make with this, and unfortunately it's going to be quite small because you won't be able to see it, is the embers that come in. The burning embers that are going to come in and light this place on fire in advance of the crown fire. Because that's what gets those nooks and crannies on those houses. That's the reason why Harold had me sweep the needles away from the foundation, because those little embers are what starts most house fires. They don't explode, they don't catch fire that way. It's kind of frustrating for me. The Australians have been doing this research work for 20 or 30, 40 years, and they've looked at hundreds of thousands of houses, and oftentimes the homeowner can be there, put the fire out with a bucket of water, okay, because it's just a burning ember stuck in one place, and then no one comes to inspect the house, okay? But I'm afraid it's going to shrink down here once I set this off here. But this is not, the shelter would never protect you under these conditions. Just watch for those embers. You can see the glow. There's one. And then pretty soon we'll see sort of a raining of them. You can see the red glow as that crown fire approaches this. There's another one, more. Now you can just see them coming in. This one has no sound, so. Okay, the last segment here. As I was asked before, this is real time. It's not time lapse. It's how fast that fire's really moving. Now I'm going to shift gears again. Any questions about those shots? Yeah, Kitty.
You said about the radiation. Can you explain that it's not the fire, it's the radiation? Can you explain what you meant by that?
Okay. Radiation is that movement, that energy movement, electromagnetic waves through space. It's like, you know, when you're standing by that bonfire and you're standing away and your jacket gets warm but your butt's cold. Okay, that's radiation being absorbed here. What I'm talking about that is that foil on that fire shelter can take that radiant energy. It can't take the convective or the direct flame contact. Okay, and that's why I said a large opening, 300 feet wide is the spec that we build into fire suppression line on very, very dangerous fires. The incident commanders will actually, or God, I got to get all terms right. The operations chief, who's in charge of that, will probably build in safety zones, 300 feet wide. And we've had a couple of incidences where crews have actually backed off, gone to the back of that when the head fire came at them. And then as the fire went around them, they moved off to the side, sort of like ants, you know, getting a little too warm and moving around. And then that's why it's important. They can talk to each other on the radio and move forward like that, crawl forward. The tough part is that the ground gets real hot. So you really need the gloves, stuff like that. Yeah, Jack?
Yeah, Ron, what was the temperature in the fire? What did they measure in Fahrenheit?
Ooh, in Fahrenheit.
Or centigrade?
Well, flame temperatures have a kind of a max. I guess it'd be in the centigrade 1500, something like that. Helen, what would you think? That's not your deal, huh? Okay. But in that game, yeah, they're all going to be about that hot. I mean, in terms of flame temperature. That's sort of the reason why, in terms of ecological things, we tend not to use temperature as a good variable, because it peaks out. You get major differences because of what we call severity of heating, but you don't see any difference in the maximum temperature. Yeah.
During the Bitterroot fire, if you looked at the trees, sometimes you could actually see them sort of exploding.
Yeah, and you could see those here too.
Yeah, was
And
that due to
that's-
like moisture?
That's radiant heat.
Oh.
The long flame lengths. Let me give you one of the numbers we throw out is that when you have those 100-foot flames, you have that sheet of flames radiating heat forward. It'll burn your bare skin at a football field away.
Wow.
Okay? And that's why the shelter is really important. And we've had a number of incidents where people have had to go into shelters simply because they were being rained on with the various the embers that you could see in those pictures. The fire wasn't actually moving up to them or threatening them, but they were being rained on with the embers, and so their nylon packs and things were burning and melting. Okay, I wanted to shift gears. Oh, what do we do here? Yeah, okay.
What technique did you use to protect the cameras? Were you just far away and using telephoto lenses?
No, these cameras were armored and nitrogen cooled, I believe. Yeah, and I think early on in the first couple of sets they broke a lot of protective lenses, you know, because they just didn't have an idea what it would take to protect those cameras. Pretty. It was Marty Alexander's idea. He's the scientist at Alberta, for the Canadian Forest Service, and he said, no, we really need these kind of these videos inside the fire. The reason why it's really important to us, I believe, is that when we actually saw those embers and how that fire moved in that crown fire, we don't model it that way. We model it as if this piece of fuel lights this one and it's continuous, when in reality, it's throwing those embers ahead and lighting fires and coming back. You probably saw that wind shift. It comes this way and go that way. See, we don't model it that way. We model it all going one way, with convection being the main driver. So that's why the science has changed, because of this particular study, when I said it was an international experimental modeling kind of research. I did want to, we doing different things, and we were talking about fire and smoke in the world, and I did want to give you somewhat of a travel log here, but some ideas about what's going on in other parts of the world in terms of fire. I got the privilege 3 weeks ago now to go to the Kingdom of Bhutan and light forest fires. Okay, not a lot of people get to do that, and unfortunately I didn't expect it to be as stressful for me as it was. This is the class here. All these Bhutanese folks are in there. They're all students. They're actually graduate foresters. They have a 3-year diploma in forestry. It's a wonderful group because they all speak excellent English. Kinley, why don't you stand here? Kinley is one of my master's students. He accompanied me there, and he too is a Bhutanese. He's in the picture, in fact. Let's see. Yeah, where is we going here? He's right there. Thanks for showing up. And it was a great opportunity because you could lecture in English and they understood it fluently. They speak American English. They weren't occupied by the British. They're not a British colony. And as Kinley told me, he started speaking English in preschool. So you don't have to say the words and they have to think about what you said. They just understand it. And so it's a great opportunity. I was there as well to teach. This is a fire ecology course and a prescribed burning course for 3 days, a short course, and also to get the Director General of Forestry to sign off on a cooperative agreement that we have between the College of Forestry and Conservation and the Ugan-Wunchuk School of Forestry, which is a brand new entity that will be, it's been funded, it's now being built and created in Boomthong. So that's an agreement between us and the University of Montana, University of Montana in that school. And I was the first kind of contingent of that whole kind of benefit and agreement. One of the things that happened to me, which is quite interesting, is that you fly into Paro. Paro, Bhutan is the only jet runway there. And you can see the skid marks here on the, okay? It is, luckily, my plane is turning around because I got to come up the valley to land. And when you're flying in a jet and you're looking up at the tops of the mountains, this is the Himalayas. So they're above you quite a ways, and then I landed and turned around and I took this picture out the window because I could see all these skid marks, because if the wind's blowing the other way, they just drop over that hill and land there, okay, with a jet. The roads, one of the things that happened to me, I flew for about 32 hours, got to Bhutan, immediately met Andres Darbant, who is an Austrian, who's in charge of who has a research project and a consultant from Austria. And we jumped into a diesel-powered Toyota Land Cruiser and took off. We drove for 8 hours that night after. And of course, you can't sleep because the road is like this. It's like the Going to the Sun road, only it's half as wide. And you can see that there's some rocks here. And it drops, I don't know, 10,000 feet, and here's some concrete bunkers, but you can't do over about 35 miles an hour. All the time I was there, my driver, and you have to have a professional driver, Jimmy Dorji, shifted it into 4th gear, that 5-speed, he shifted into 4th gear 4 times, and then didn't go 100 yards before he had to downshift again into 3rd. It's also so windy that he had to hit his horn at every turn. And so you don't sleep no matter how tired you are when you do that. You also have a lot of different places where the road fails here, and you can see the dozer there trying to push the stuff out of the way. But that's the highway. This is the main highway that moves across east and west. You also have a lot of transport trucks. This is a Tata brand truck from India. They move that material all across the country, and you can see that rig is as wide as the road right there. So that's why we're over here in the ditch, okay? And that's why you honk the horn. Blow horn, okay? This is part of the deal. When you come up there in this windy road, you honk your horn. And when the driver knows you're there, when he realizes that it's a straight enough stretch and he can't see anybody coming up the other way, he pulls off very politely off to the left and you go around on the right. They drive on the left side of the road. So, yes, they're all painted up, very ornate. They really like that stuff. And every place you go, you will see different prayer flag and religious facilities, religious buildings honoring certain people as well as certain sites in terms of and you'll see them all over, a large number of them. In terms of vegetation, there's lots of foresters here. We go way up high. These are true fir stands. I couldn't see, there been no fire in those true fir stands. They're very old. In fact, they're rotten to the core. All high, as in most cases with true fir that live a long time. They have a lot of heart rot. Spruce as well, big forests of spruce High elevation, we're probably at 12,000 feet here. Beautiful blue pine. This is the main tree in the western and the central part of Bhutan. They're a white pine, a 5-needle pine. They look very, very much like western white pine, except that there's no ribes in the understory. So we don't have the problem of white pine blister rust like we do here. We also have a lot of hardwood forests, more tropical forests, and a lot of rhododendrons, hundreds of species of rhododendrons. And as you can see, I'm in the wrong season. That's why they let me in the country. Okay? The tourist season really works. That's what they really go for, is to look at all the various rhododendrons as you're moving along. And you can see the highway there, as it's just right out of the cliff. Okay? That's where we're going. And this is sheer pine. This is the site that I was burning. These are, you can see why I was drawn to ponderosa pine, right? This is sheer pine in Bhutan, in eastern Bhutan. Grasslands. It's hard to see how steep that is. Here's an example of a sheer pine, a young stand that's had a fire through it. You can see how the fire's kind of scorched and killed the lower branches and raised the needles a little bit. We did see some wildlife. This is actually a domestic yak, lemurs, which is a primate. This is the national animal. This is a takin. It's kind of, the story goes that this is a combination of a goat and a cow. I believe that's right. Kinley, is that right? Yeah. And it's quite a big animal. That's probably almost as big as an elk, body-wise. I'd say that. They also, in the Projuka Valley, this is the Projuka Valley here. This is a wetland. We've got grazing going on, as we do everywhere in Bhutan. These kind of specks out here, these two white specks, those are black-necked cranes. And this is the one of the very important wintering grounds for black-necked crane when they come out of China. And they were everywhere, actually. They're not a large number, but you could look in different directions. When Kinley first pointed them out to me, I sure they were cows. You know, and then as we got closer, you could see that, and they would actually get up and flap their wings and move around. So it's pretty neat. Now, why did I go there? As I said, to teach a course. This is actually a youth center. When the students aren't in school, they come to this center, do different sports. It's sort of like a dorm in the lower part where they can sleep, and we utilize it as a teaching facility. So you can see the motorcycles there. That's standard issue for their foresters. They're extension foresters out in the woods, because you can kind of see with the roads, that probably worked pretty well. Although it's tough to drive for 12 hours on one. Having done that, I know what you mean here. Okay. This is just a little bit of the teaching. Like I said, tremendous advantage to being a lecturer in English. And straight away, get questions. They had the readings. I had that prepared. And I was often, just like here, you know, I'm kind of a techno-peasant, like I said. And I was wondering, boy, will I have the appropriate technology? Do they have that expectation of PowerPoints and doing all that stuff? And what I'll tell you is that overhead was great. I had the overhead projector was perfect, because I had a white sheet spread across in front of that chalkboard that you see there off to the left, and that chalkboard right there. And that's what I would use to project my overheads on. And then, unfortunately, every afternoon the power would go out. So I couldn't have shown a PowerPoint if I wanted to. We'd open all the windows. We'd pull the sheet down, and I would use my chalkboard like I'm very much used to. Okay, so it was the appropriate technology for the scene, and it worked quite well, and we got through it. This is an example of that classroom. We put 45 guys in there. It was pretty tough to me, but they were very attentive. We had I gave 4 hour-and-a-half lectures a day for the 3 days, and we had tea breaks at 10:30 and at 3, I guess, and it worked quite well. The reason beyond that was also, and the stress part for me was that I had to burn. And it's one thing to go and consult and learn some culture and meet with people and kind of give your ideas on a piece of paper. It's a whole nother thing to have the rubber where, meets the road, where you light the fire and it doesn't get away. Okay? And these are Australian drip torches that were left by Australians that kind of came before me 2 years before. Once you fill them with fuel, you can't ship them back, right? You can't put them in an airplane because they've had fuel inside them. I bring this up because what happened is when I got there, after driving for those 16 hours to get that far to Mongar, Bhutan, we went the next day to the field to look at the plots. And there's, the Australians had high intensity, low intensity plots and controls, and that replicated 3 times on this hillside. And I got up there and walked around, and there were no fire lines around the plots. This is a 70% slope in grass, under pines, in the middle of their fire season. And, you can see that I was pretty nervous about that whole situation, that this American was supposed to show them how to do it, and I could lose these fires pretty easily. We did well. The other part, here you don't have any fire line constructed, but this happens to be a community forest. The Kingdom of Bhutan has set aside a number of forest management units, thus the only place where the country actively harvests timber. 60% of the country is in a protected area management in a national park or some other conservation program. And in addition to that, there are community forests where these extension foresters deal with the community, and when they need trees or need the lumber, they work that out. And the forester sets up the timber sale, so it's harvested very efficiently, gives them that great service. So the community people were called upon to build a fire line. Okay, and it's frustrating for a forester because I immediately asked the fellow, do you have a roll of flagging? And they had no flagging. They had to go back to town, which was 2 hours, and tear up red cloth and tie them on a little bamboo pole so they could show the village people where they wanted the fire line cut. Okay, this is an example of tools. Some of the fire people here will recognize the tool on the far left as a McLeod tool. That's one of the 7 McLeods in the whole country. Okay, because the Australians brought those too. So we're very limited in terms of fire equipment. That's the other thing that worried me. There was not a shovel on the site. We didn't have anything like that to catch the rolling cones or to trench the line or whatever. So it was an exciting time. We did have that swatter. Okay, right there. We lit a test fire. That worked quite well. Later, all other things were being equal, in terms of intensity. Now, when we talk about intensity, you can affect intensity by the weight of the available fuel, how much is fuels there. We can and that also depends on what kind of moisture contents the fuels are in. We also affect it by the rate of spread. Okay? And here I was on a hillside, all the grass, all dry, probably at about 6% moisture content. So the only choice I had to give that Austrian high intensity or low intensity was to change the ignition pattern, something I talked to the students quite a bit about. And so this is an example of a flanking fire. We use the flanking fire as the low intensity for the treatment. And in adjacent to that, we also, you can see the grass fuels there. We also, the high intensity plots then were strip head fires. And that's a fire burning upslope with the wind. So it's much more intense, probably about 2 or 3 meter flame lengths compared to the 2 meter flame lengths or 1 meter flame lengths that we would see in the flanking fire. This is one of the interesting parts. When I first went, I thought, geez, there's a chance because I'm going in their fire season, I might kill all the trees on the site. That'd be a heck of a thing too, right? If it didn't get away, but I killed all the trees, it wouldn't be good. And in reality, this is a sheer pine, and it sprouts. Okay, so you can see the dead stems, the 2 or 3 dead stems there, and yet it sprouted back. So there was no way I was going to kill any of those trees. They're very well adapted to fire. Why are we doing this? Just to finish up, we're doing this because the country in eastern Bhutan, the people wanted, the country wanted to improve their status and to have them have a regular annual cash crop. And that cash crop is that grass, that's lemongrass. And they can put it in these large cookers here that you see. We can heat the steam, and it drives off those essential oils, and they come down in this coil, and then they fall out that hole and are collected. And the country subsidized them to purchase the cookers. This is one of the largest plants around because it's a double. And then they also buy the oil from them. So it's a way that they can get an annual cash crop instead of waiting, it's a long time to grow a tree. So it's part of that whole country development. Now, what's the real problems that I see? And I'll just end here. One of the real problems to me is that when you drive, and as I did, and look at all the hillsides, foresters are used to reading the landscape, looking at that swoosh of larch. They have larch there too, so you should be able to see those larch that can take pretty high intensity fire and still survive. And you'll see the landscape change and the way the color and the grains of the trees go, that there was a large fire here many years ago and a large one here many years ago. You see that if you go to Glacier Park and go up to that switchback, and it shows the garden wall fire and all those various fires. Okay? It's just reading the landscape. And when I first went, when Keely and I first talked about going, we were pretty sure, I was pretty sure, there has to be more lightning fires than that, than zero. You'd think. Kingdom of Bhutan, it gets its name, is the thunder dragon because of the lightning. But almost all the lightning comes with rain, real rain. Montana rain, where your wipers don't go fast enough for periods of time. And so we don't get a lot of lightning fires. And from what I could see when I looked at the landscape, that's got to be correct. I didn't want it to be that way, but it's a situation where we don't have natural fire. Okay? And what we're looking at, these blue pine, are all the trees that have come back after the original people who were there actively burned and grazed, just like native people. They burned this land. There are no stumps up there, and none of these trees are over 100 years old. And it's because they were repeatedly burned for the last 4,000 years, perhaps. Okay? And so what's natural? Okay? Or what does the country need in terms of that ignition? That's why they had me come and talk about prescribed fire. When I talked to Dutch and Dorji, who is the head of that forestry school, I said, if we're talking about fire, I want you to understand that we've put ourselves in a position by ignoring native people and taking them out of that and not making them natural fire. And we've created a situation where we spend $1 billion a year fighting fires. $1 billion a year. And I asked him, do you guys want to go down that? I don't think you should go down that road. And he looked at me and he says, you got that right. Okay? And that's how I ended up in Bhutan and talking about these situations. What I see is a real problem in the blue pine. This is the beautiful tree here. It makes wonderful white pine paneling, just beautiful stuff. In all the hotels I stayed in, there's a lot really nice paneling. The problem is that because they've come back and there hasn't been any intermediate fire, which would have escaped from all the burning that they were doing for agriculture and for maintaining grasslands for their cattle, and we have very high density stands, very, very high density stands of all age structure, and in fact we saw a few wildfires there, and they were pretty destructive. They managed to, you can see the prayer flags there. See if you see that. Right there. And there's prayer flags right there. That tells me that it was a surface fire. It wasn't a crown fire. And yet all those trees are dead. Okay, because of the severity of the surface fire. Well, that's something we can deal with. And I believe that we can probably reduce the stocking of some of those stands. We'll kill some trees. But that, in a landscape sense, is about the only way we're going to deal with Bhutan. Think about the size of the country. That we're talking about a country that's as big as Switzerland, about 1/12 of Montana. And it's like this. Yeah, Gary, let's, these people, good.
Ron, what's the future of prescribed fire in the United States when you think about climate change and the fact that this country produces 25% of all the CO2 in the world? What's the future? You know, the Forest Service's plans in the past have been, and I think they've been funded to at least to a degree, to do prescribed fire. And so what's the future of prescribed fire? And in context with your presentation, that's something we need to do.
Well, how would I put that? If we look at the year, and I'll put it in CO2 context, but in terms of smoke, in 1988, burning 1 million acres in Yellowstone, maybe a little more, maybe 1.4 million acres of Yellowstone. That whole event didn't produce 2% of the world's smoke. Now, I still think it's more of a, I still believe it's more of a social problem. The whole issue of, I guess I have to put it in another perspective. I don't know, Gary, what's going to happen if we begin to do a lot of this carbon trading and that kind of allocation, because that may change the game quite a bit. But we do have a system where we're spending $1 billion a year now. Just imagine as the system dries and we get more changes in weather, more violent changes in weather, and more fire. You know, I think that's the question. We're going to get more fire. And the only thing that, as we can see on the landscape scale, the only thing that seemed to help us in terms of controlling the behavior of the fire, changing the survival of the trees, was prescribed fire itself. All the thin stands, I didn't show any thin stands in the picture, all the thin stands were 100% mortality. You wonder why in the Bitterroot, after the Bitterroot fires, they didn't run around and show us thin stands, well-treated stands that survive fire, because they can't show us any. They made them stumps because they're all dead. I mean, I just have to say that. So, because they did not treat the surface fuels. We have situations even now with that Hayes Creek thing down there, and you know, landowners treated the same way. They thinned the trees just like the Forest Service did down below, but no one's treated the fine fuels on the ground. So it just is a situation where we have more people on the trail, more likelihood of ignition moving right to the house. That's my worry. In terms of this global stuff, I'm not really sure what we're going to do, because as we begin to trade in carbon, it's just a different game.
Forestry around the world, though, is going to be doing more burning, I would suspect.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an issue we're going to have to look at.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. Other questions here? You've been a very patient audience. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Ron.